6 months have passed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's become Europe's worst armed conflict in decades. Tens of thousands of civilians and soldiers are likely to have been killed. Millions more have been forced to flee the country or have been internally displaced. Factories, hospitals, bridges, schools and residences have been destroyed. A Russian military presence in Belarus near the Ukraine border was an early sign that President Putin's threats to invade Ukraine would materialize.
Russia was conducting a military exercise in Belarus, so the war fears that that presence of Russian troops so close to the Ukrainian border in the north, where it's bordering Belarus, is not just a military exercise, that they essentially would be doing something. And, we have to consider it within a broader context of what was happening at the time. And for years, Ukraine has been cooperating with NATO. And there was kind of this danger that Ukraine might be eventually joining NATO.
When Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February, it had hoped to overrun the country in a blitz lasting only a few days or weeks. But as Moscow's invasion reaches the 6-month mark, the Kremlin appears to be stuck in what looks like a war of attrition, with no end in sight and few successes on the battlefield. However, it seems increasingly unlikely to loosen its grip on the territory it has gained so far.
Essentially, they underestimated the enemy. They have overstretched their forces, exposing them to adversary strikes. And, of course, they didn't expect that amount of help from the NATO alliance.
When Kyiv didn't block the border with Belarus and left a path to Crimea not fortified enough, Russian forces promptly arrived on the outskirts of Kyiv and other big cities. But soon they lost this benefit. Convoys of Russian armour seemed stalled on long stretches of highway. Troops ran out of supplies, especially fuel, becoming easy targets. Russian forces retreated, leaving a trail of dead bodies behind. The images from the town of Bucha, an hour's drive from Kyiv, of bodies burned, bodies with hands bound, bodies strewn near bicycles and flattened cars, have seared themselves into global consciousness like no other. In the meantime, Russia declared a shift of focus to the eastern industrial region of the Donbass, where Moscow-backed separatists have been fighting Ukrainian forces since 2014. Russia has seized significant chunks of territory around the Crimean Peninsula that Moscow annexed 8 years ago. It has also managed to cut Ukraine off completely from the Sea of Azov, finally securing full control over the key port of Mariupol after an almost 3-month siege. Moscow's losses have forced it to rely increasingly on hastily patched together units that could only make small gains. But the offensive in the east seems to have become bogged down as well, as Western arms flow into Ukraine to bolster its outgunned army. Russian artillery and warplanes relentlessly pound Ukrainian positions, trying to break through defences built up during the separatist conflict. They've made only incremental gains, clearly reflecting both Russia's insufficient troop numbers and the Ukrainian resistance. Russia recently lost hundreds of personnel and dozens of combat vehicles while trying to cross a river to build a bridgehead. Rather than a massive campaign, the Kremlin opted for tactical mini-offences aimed at steadily trying to encircle Ukrainian forces. The Donbass fighting has increasingly turned into an artillery duel.
Once that happened and once they saw that the amount of resistance and the fact that they are not achieving their initial operational aims, they have withdrawn to Donbass in order to concentrate the forces there. And, politically, they have also recognized the independence of those Donetsk and Lugansk republics. And so they relied also on the forces there, on the people there, because they didn't have enough manpower. And given that it's a special military operation, it's not a war, which means they cannot mobilize everybody.
Ukraine, meanwhile, continues to receive a steady flow of Western arms, including US howitzers and drones, tanks from Poland, and other heavy gear that is immediately sent into combat. Ukrainian authorities are increasingly emboldened by the slow pace of the Russian offensive and growing Western support. President Volodymyr Zelensky reaffirmed that pushing the Russians back to pre-invasion positions would represent a victory. But some aides declared even more ambitious goals, adding that Russia will probably take control over resisting Donbas areas by the autumn. In August, there was some hope as the first ship carrying Ukrainian grain set off from the port of Odessa under an internationally brokered deal by Turkey's initiatives that is expected to release large stores of Ukrainian crops to foreign markets and ease a growing hunger crisis. But in the same month, explosions and fires ripped through an ammunition depot in Russia-annexed Crimea, forcing the evacuation of more than 3,000 people. The alleged attack by the Ukrainian military also damaged a section of the nearby railroad. Russia blamed the blasts in the villages of Mayskoye and Avovskoye on an act of sabotage without naming the perpetrators. Analysts say that they don't expect an end to the fighting anytime soon. Both sides see opportunities in the winter.
I don't think that the fighting will end anytime soon. Neither side has really exhausted its supply of weapons or people. I think both sides think that going into the winter especially, they'll be able to gain an advantage over the other, right? Russia believes that its ability to restrict gas shipments to Europe will give them more leverage and maybe make Ukraine's NATO friends push Ukraine to sort of settle. Ukraine, on the other hand, thinks that Russian forces aren't going to want to fight in the dead of winter, whereas Ukrainian forces are more motivated to defend their homeland. So I don't see an end to this.